She's in opposition to an all-powerful, all-light male god at the top of a pyramid.
If I went to church and this is what happened, it would have healed a lot early on.
Hello and welcome. This is a very special episode of the Down to Astro podcast that we are dedicating solely to Lilith, both in the myth of the goddess herself and in terms of the astrology and the associations between the myth and the astrological point of what we call Black Moon Lilith, because we have just added Black Moon Lilith to the Chani app, and we're so excited to all gather here today to talk about the one and the only. I'm Chani Nicholas.
I'm Thea Anderson.
And I'm Eliza Robertson.
Okay, so this is the structure. This is the lay of the land. In this episode, we're going to talk about who is Lilith in mythology, what is Black Moon Lilith in astrology, why should we care about this ancient goddess and what she has to tell us, why should we look up our Black Moon Lilith point in our astrological chart on the Chani app specifically. And then we're going to go through some chart examples of how Black Moon Lilith shows up in some of our favorite figures, and also how to work with her in your personal chart, and also like just on an ongoing basis. So just to start and just to like lay down a little bit of a foundation about who Lilith is, some of you will know her really well, and some of you will have no idea who we're talking about. So one of our hopes is just to also spark some curiosity about who this is and also all the ways in which she shows up. So we are talking about an archetype, right? An archetypal force, a goddess who exists before written language. So once she comes into written language, A of all, we're mostly already dealing with patriarchy. So we know that we're in that schism, that pyramid scheme. But B of all, a lot of the myths and a lot of the writings about her are existing as we're coming out of purely oral traditions into written ones. And so there's fragments, there's pieces here, there's pieces there. I've talked to many different rabbis about Lilith as she is connected to Jewish mythology and Jewish stories and different Jewish traditions. And they've all given me different ideas about who she is and also where she shows up and what it is that's being written about her. So, all that to say, she's beyond reason and she's beyond written word. And we're going to try to not pin her down, but evoke some of her meanings here to honor the different lineages she comes from and the different ways in which she appears through thought, through wisdom traditions, throughout many different ages. So we're talking about a lot of different peoples and a lot of different interpretations. So there's nothing clear cut and linear here, but that is also very Lilith. So she exists outside of the word. She is timeless. She is ancient. She is eternal. She is the owl. She is the snake. She is the wind. She is the tree. She is chaos, the chaos of creation. And she is related to all creeping things. She is the night. She has taloned feet. She has hairy legs. She has wild and full hair. She is, like all ancient goddesses, orgiastic. She is wild. She is the untamable energy of creation. She is both destructive and prolific in her ability to create and recreate. She is disordered in the face of a male patriarchal god who demands order. She is non-logical. She doesn't fit in, or she doesn't remain, she doesn't belong in the center of systems that favor logic. So she exists on the margins. She is sexually untethered from any kind of like moral judgment that patriarchy would try to put upon her. She is thrilling. She is terrifying. Since the emergence of patriarchy, she is the repository of all of man's fears about the night, about female sexuality. She is maligned, she is marginalized, she is blamed, she is shamed, she is shunned, disrespected, and also many people will say distorted. She is the explanation for why some of the worst things in the world happen. She is the power of dark feminine energy as it is split from conscious feminine energy underneath the systems that we live within. And therefore, she also holds the psychic baggage of a system that introduced this kind of binary thinking. So she is in opposition. It's, as we'll discover in these later iterations of God and goddess and a patriarchal God, she's in opposition to an all-powerful, all-light male god at the top of a pyramid. So the name Lilith might come from Akkadian Lilitu, meaning of the night or night monster. Lila is also the name for night in Hebrew. She's related to the words, like her name Lilith is related to many words from many different ancient cultures that have to do with night, nighttime, demons, monsters, shadows. And we meet Lilith in the written word, perhaps first in the myth of Inanna. So this is one of the books that I think I think all three of us lean on heavily. It's a gorgeous interpretation, translation of the myths about Inanna. It's called Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth, and it is by Diane Wilkstein and Samuel Noah Kramer. And we meet her here. Perhaps it's some will say the translation is her actual name, but we might meet her here in Inanna's garden, and Eliza will go into that myth. And then we meet her again much later in the Jewish retellings of creation myth in the Garden of Eden. So I'm going to hand this over to Eliza to take us through some of her earlier iterations and what she means before Judaism gets a hold of her.
Thank you. I just have to say that was like an incantation. I feel like she is thoroughly invoked and in the room as we speak.
Yes, we welcome Lilith and honor, and thank you for joining us. We hope to do you justice. Please be merciful upon us.
Okay, so as you said, one of the first iterations of stories in which she appears that we have our hands on, because like you explained, Chani, she predates the written word, and all we have access to are documents or poems or songs that were written down. But of course, humanity and storytelling didn't start with the alphabet. It didn't start with writing. So I actually think she's much more ancient even than those poems to Inanna, which were, we can date those back to around 2000 before Common Era. So that's what, 4,000 years ago? But I think she's much more ancient than that. So I just want to flag that. But this is some of her first appearances in the written word. And what's so interesting to me in this story, which I'll go into, is that she seems to create this binary between the civilized, cultivated, fertile world, the agricultural world, and then what is wild and barren and like untamable. So I'll get into that a bit more. So what happens is in one of these stories, in that translation of the poems to Inanna, so the ones translated by Diane Wilkstein and Samuel Kramer, Inanna plants a halupu tree. And this itself is very important because it's not a wild tree. It's a tree that she plucks out of the river and she plants in her garden. And her hopes for this tree is that she wants to eventually cut it down and use the wood for her marriage bed and for her throne. So already we're in this space of cultivation for the use of humans, or for the use of, in this case, Banana arguably is not a human, but for the use of one's queendom. So there's that. So Inanna plants this tree to eventually cut it down and turn it into her throne and her marriage bed. And then what happens is that the tree becomes infested. And at the root of the tree, there's this snake that winds around the trunk. And in the branches of the tree, we see this bird, an Anzu bird. And at the trunk of the tree, in this translation, it is said that Lilith is there. So Lilith is one of these infestations. And as Chani, you alluded to also, both the snake and the bird are representations of Lilith in different stories and in different myths. So both of these kind of relate to her. And they're all wild. They're all these wild creatures that are sort of meddling with Inanna's plans to like cut this tree down and make her marriage bed. So she calls over Gilgamesh, who's this very solar hero, which is maybe comparable to this like male light god. And Gilgamesh cuts down the tree. And so the snake, you know, slithers away, the bird takes off, and Lilith also has to flee. And in the poem, it says she flees to these wild desert barren lands. And this is so, as we'll see as we go through the other stories of Lilith, there's a theme of exile. And I think this is kind of where it starts, at least in terms of the documents we have access to. She's banished from this tree, from this thing that we often encounter in the wild, but which is wanting to be used for, or wanted to be used for, civilized quote unquote purposes. And she's banished, slash, she also, exiles herself and takes refuge in the barren lands in the desert. So that's her first iteration. If you want to go into next representations, Jenny.
Many scholars have pointed this out in that myth, like Eliza, you said, but just to like bring it back around, the goddess is the tree, the goddess is the snake, the goddess is the bird. So it's an interesting situation that we're in, because Inanna is the great goddess of heaven and earth. And in that myth, she's afraid of these spirits that have infested the tree, but they're her. If she's the great goddess, those are just different aspects of herself. And they're also the three. And so you'll see the, three related to magic, related to spell casting, but always related to goddesses, as in later iterations, we could say like maiden, mother, crone, but also in related to the phase of the moon, that the moon is basically, you can't see her for 3 days, the day before, the day of, and the day after the new moon. And so it's always the symbol of the goddess's great cycle of life, of death and rebirth, and that was always a part of it. So that part of the myth always strikes me as like, why would she have to get Gilgamesh to go cut down a tree? Like, why would she be afraid of that? She goes into the underworld, she faces death. Like, she's hardcore. She's not like some docile, soon to be wife. But
Demure.
yeah, she's not demure. But in that part of the myth, that always is like jarring. Like, it doesn't make sense to me. So it's also, and again, a lot of feminist scholars have said this, but it's like, is that the introduction of patriarchy, that this male god comes into the garden? And what is the garden but like our like inner chambers and inner self, and also this place of pleasure and resplendence and sexuality and relaxation. The garden is related to Venus, Inanna is related to Venus. And so there's this duality of like the goddess and the evil feminine spirits, and they're put at odds with each other. And also, I always try to think about the myths as like from a lot of different perspectives. It's like, i- if the goddess wants to be married, when the earlier iterations of goddess didn't necessarily belong to any one person, but were pretty sexually free in a lot of the oldest myths. Is that what has to happen? Do we have to cut something down, or does something have to be
Hmm.
scared away, or is there this introduction of polarization? Those are just my questions.
I think Just to respond to that, I think it
Yeah.
does match the timeline. Like I think around 2000 BCE, you are seeing that tension and that rise of patriarchy. And I'm not a historian, so I'm sure there's way more nuance that it's escaping me in this moment. But I feel like you see that within those poems. If people go out and read that translation, which I really encourage folks to do because it is gorgeous, there are other let's say chapters or you know vignettes of Inanna where she appears much more self-sovereign, much more in her own power and not, wanting to get this tree cut down so she can have her marriage bed. I think we see her in different iterations. So I wonder if those poems too are in some ways encapsulating that tension and that shift, that like huge social shift, but also that time frame around 2000 BCE, that was the age of Taurus. So like we hear it was
What do
towards
you
the
mean,
end.
Taurus?
So you know how we talk about like the age of Aquarius?
Oh,
Everyone's
Eliza.
heard of that.
Oh
No,
my
but
god.
wait. No, but wait. But wait. Hear me
I'm
out.
with you. I'm with you. I'm with you.
Following.
So when you like decouple it from the,
Yeah.
the woo and the
Yeah.
60s,
Yeah.
what that actually refers to is what is the constellation that you see rising in the sky on the spring equinox, on the vernal equinox.
Yeah.
And
Because of something called precession of the equinox.
yes. Yes. So because the fixed stars technically aren't fixed and they very, very, very slowly actually shift over millennia, the constellation that is rising on the spring equinox actually shifts over about 2000 years.
Right.
So 2000 years ago, in about zero,
Mhm.
when we started counting time in this way, in this fashion, it was Aries. And that's why we consider Aries the first sign of the zodiac. But 2000 years before that, actually, it was Taurus. The reason I bring this up is because in this era, like, so these poems take place in ancient Sumer, which is a part of what historians have called the Fertile Crescent. So it's this part of what is now, I believe, Iraq, I might be mistaken, but around that region. And they had found a way to irrigate the land and to create this lushness and to create this incredible agriculture, which itself is very Venusian, Venus ruling Taurus, also Taurus being an earth sign and representing agriculture and what we can grow from the land. But that itself was fairly new and a fairly innovative phenomenon. And I do think Lilith stands in opposition to that because she's not cultivated, she's not tamed, she's not for, growing for human consumption. She's not consumable. She's completely wild. So I do think that's an interesting paradox. And for whatever reason, and who knows who wrote that poem initially, Inanna seems to be representing this more fertile, cultivated land, whereas Lilith is kind of this foil for that. She's more barren. And that, that might speak more to the author of that poem than who these goddesses really were, because I do think they are
Mhm.
one, like you pointed
Yeah.
to.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think once we have the written word, we're in a different time frame. So, and again, anything that we're reading that was written at some place, we're talking about civilization. And there's in many different areas at many different ancient texts, especially that are connected to astrology in many different languages, you hear about the threat of the wild and the wanting to keep the wild out of the city or out of the town. And there's a distinct kind of paranoia that starts to come in and a fear and for very good reason. There's a lot of sickness, there's a lot of death, there's a lot of disease that there's not a lot of answers for or ways to cure. So and there's a lot of terror and there's a lot of wild animals, and there's like the wildness of the wild is a threat to civilization. But we also don't know, and we do know about we're talking about a very like specific part of the world, but we do know other cultures, indigenous cultures around the world that live with the wild and are highly, what we call like civilized and have tons of you, all the things that all civilized cultures have just in their own way, that are more one with the earth and less afraid, it seems. So I'm always thinking about that as well. It's like these particular cultures around this part of the world at these times, like these, couple thousands of years that we're talking about, that we start getting these stories from. They are civilized, and they settle, I should say. They settle in a certain way that seems to start to create this distrust of what is wild. And then also just noting that the wild is harsh. You are open to elements that the cities or the township, or when collections of people are around, you're in some ways, in a lot of ways, more buffered from.
So is that I
Yeah.
I thought that was beautiful. First of all, if I went to church and this is what happened, it would have healed a lot early on. Um, and so I just love that Lilith is in the room and we're talking about this and you're guiding us through the stories. And this, if we think about like a tree, which is kind of, it's got roots that we don't see, like kind of stretching down to the dark shadow underworld, but we also need it to sustain life. And so I'm thinking about like what it means that like Anana experienced that infestation and like Lilith was a part of that like infestation. And that whole theme of, oh, this doesn't belong here is antithetical to building something that we can sustain life, that we can like have, I don't know, maybe what else you do with the tree, build shelter, build schools, all this sort of thing that you're speaking to, Chani. And then Eliza, you walked us through like the whole tree. And then Gilgamesh comes in and is like, okay, I'm gonna cut it down, or I'm gonna separate. And that feels almost like, I don't know, bodily, like oof. Like now we've done something that maybe was creates the binary, creates the light and the dark. Maybe before it was all kind of messy, and that's why the infestation was here. So I feel like we'll probably through this episode revisit that idea of the infestation or something being in a place where it's like doesn't belong, and you want to kind of you know clean it up and get it out of your house.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, all those are that was what was really striking to me as you were talking.
Yeah, it's the response of fear and a desire to remove, which is, I always think of Lilith's origins as they appear in written form as the roots of all suppressive systems and thinking, because it is about being driven by fear, right? All systems of suppression, or sorry, systems of dominance and systems of supremacy is what I want to say, is driven by a fear response to something that we deem as the other, or as we'll come to know Lilith as unclean, or in some way wrongly created. So then again, Lilith is a goddess, and then you'll see in her astronomical significations, as we deal with her in astrology, is she's a very obscure, like hard to get to type of entity, goddess, spirit, presence. So she then kind of disappears in a lot of ways from the written word. We find her, though, in we find her in many different traditions in the ancient world. So we find her, or the likes of her, in ancient Sumerian, Akkadian, and Judaic mythology, um, Islamic stories and mythologies, and ways of thinking about night spirits, night demons, and just like different types of winds, right? So there's different types of winds are related to different maladies or different kind of conditions. This is the ancient world, so they're thinking about the natural world in ways that impact your physical system and your safety. So because she's the goddess of the wind, because she's the screech owl, because she's night, then she's going to like come and go in ways that are almost invisible to us. So then we start to, in one of the translations of the Torah in Isaiah 34, some of them mention her by name in one passage. Then we see her in the Talmud, and then we see her in the Zohar, which are ancient Judaic texts that talk about and extrapolate from the Torah, from the First Testament. And those are written over, periods of time with lots of different rabbinic takes and what we call midrash. And and again, if you ask different rabbis, you'll get different ideas about who she is and what she represents. I think without understanding how new God is, we don't really understand Lilith, because the idea of a one male God is like 5 minutes ago in terms of human history and in terms of human consciousness. It is probably one of the most ridiculous ideas that we've ever clung to. However, we're coming out of human histories. Mostly, many people can prove this if you look at a lot of different historians and a lot of, again, different like feminist goddess scholars or scholars on the goddess, that we're coming out of forever. There's just so many different ways of seeing the earth and the act of creation as something that is definitely not from a male dominated one dude in the sky perspective. So it's a very, very new. And when we meet Lilith in places like the Talmud and the Zohar, we meet her with this distinct disdain and fear of who she is and what she can do. Now, again, I want to reiterate that there was a lot of things to be afraid of in the ancient world. There still is. Like, it's not like we don't have to be afraid of these things. But one of the main things that Lilith is blamed for is really what we would now call SIDS, is sudden infant death syndrome. So Lilith is the easiest way to see Lilith, especially in like ancient Jewish society, but in all kinds of those ancient societies, is through amulets that were created to ward her off in the baby's crib or in the baby's domain, probably just in the house because we probably just shared a room. But there's many, many amulets warding her off. And there's a deal in one of her stories, that she says, if there's an amulet there, I'll leave the baby alone. So we meet her as this succubus. We meet her as a witch. We meet her as an entity that will come into your house if you dare sleep alone. So we're talking about the creation of monogamy, but we're talking about the creation of like a certain sort of family structure, I do think. But if you dare sleep alone, especially as a man, Lilith will come into your bed at night and give you wild dreams, basically wet dreams, and and have you emit emissions, and then she'll steal them. And from those, she will go off and spawn 1,000 demon babies. And so there's this idea of being afraid of your own sexuality and your own desires and your own nocturnal self, so that she has to be warded off by making sure you're always sleeping with your husband or wife, basically. And so there's this thing that she, in a lot of these like little excerpts that you'll find from her, you'll hear a lot of this stuff about warding her off from the home and making sure she's not around. And the thought of not like quote unquote like spilling your seed in any way that isn't for procreation is just exceptionally patriarchal and weird. But you can also relate it to other kind of ancient traditions of being really intentional about your sexuality. And we're talking about people who have penises here and sperm to like spill not spill. But the fact of the matter is that there's I think I want to be like holistic about my thinking in this, and that there's a lot of traditions that are like, hey, this is really sacred stuff. You want to be intentional with how you work with it and what you're doing with it, and this is part of the act of creation. So if I'm being like generous with my interpretations, I do think that that can be present, but mostly she's used to evoke this fear of what happens when no one else is around. So even like fear of relationship to one's own body. However, okay, so when we meet her in a longer form, and there are sections of the Zohar where she's very present, and I just want to say the Zohar is also a Jewish text that speaks prolifically about the Shekhinah, which is the feminine aspect of God. And so it's not that Judaism is without goddess. It's just that and you have to think of the ways in which they're thinking about stuff is very complex, and there's a lot of different sides to it, and in many ways you can interpret it. And also, we're talking about written language. We're talking about a patriarchal God. We're talking about the introduction of that. And I do think, in a lot of ways, if you look at the myths of the sun and the moon in 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 Judaism, that are, I think, connected to Lilith, as Barbara Black Koltzoff does in this book. She starts out with the myths of the sun and the moon. There's a whole thing about the moon diminishing herself in the face of the sun and being really pissed off about it, and having this like tension of like, you don't think I'm as powerful or as worthy of life as you, between the moon and the sun. So you start to see these like origin stories that we could relate to these later Lilith stories. So both in the Zohar, we have a really strong connection to the people of Israel, as they're called, then the land, the people itself being Shekhinah, being the goddess, being the physical manifest. Everything that's down is related to Shekhinah, the goddess, we could say, in short, just to be succinct about it. So she is present, and Lilith is also, happening within that kind of imagination. And also, just to say that, especially like ancient Judaism, before and even during its need to survive Christianity, there's a really complex way of thinking about demons, and Lilith is definitely a demon spirit. But demons exist. They are a part of God. So it's not the puritanical way of seeing things that a lot of Christian traditions have us thinking about. Like, yes, so there's that. Yes, there's a polarization. Yes, there's the woman is bad, man is good situation. And also within that, there is a full acceptance of Lilith as being part of the world. So demons and these entities, these spirits, are part of creation, and they have a place in it. So I just want us to stay kind of like a little bit stretchy in our thinking when we're talking about these stories too, like as we're listening to this. So the Ben Sira, the alphabet of Ben Sira, is a text that we find like this kind of full story in. And it's also like, it's not that old. It's from the Middle Ages, which, yes, is very old. But in terms of like human history, it's like, again, 2 minutes ago. And especially in terms of like when the Torah was like, put together, and then we get to the Middle Ages. It's a long time. And we don't know who wrote this. This is an anonymous thing. Some Jewish scholars are like, that is a satirical work. That is, even like some would say, like anti-Semitic in a way, like because we don't know where this thing is from, because we don't know what the intention was for writing it. Again, we're getting this origin story that's also kind of shrouded in like, where is this from? What is this? Like, who wrote this? And we don't know. We don't have those answers. But the stories that come from this, again, in its kind of fullest form, or in its like one place, is this. So in the Garden of Eden, God, who is they? So we have to understand that the part of the origin myth is that God is they. God is both female and masculine. God is not just one. So again, this stuff is really complicated. You'll find one thing here and another thing here, and they won't necessarily go together. So God is they. God is they created Adamah. Adamah is Adam. Adamah is the earth, is from the earth. Adamah is created in the image of God. So Adamah is both male and female. So we have our first character as not man or woman. We have our first character as whole. But Adamah starts to get jealous and starts to get yearnings as they see the animals doing their thing, getting their groove on in the garden. Everyone's enjoying. It's a Venus era. And God is like, okay, well, you need a mate. And so from from the same source material, right? In some ways it's like Adam, but uh God creates two. this is the first coupling. Out of the one, God creates two. So there's a split here. And God creates Lilith to be the mate of Adam. And in some texts, you'll see that Lilith is created from the sediment and the filth of the earth, right? Adamah is the earth. And then they're like, well, we created Lilith from the most impure parts of the earth. Fine. So they're in the garden and they're like, oh, let's start naming things. Like, let's bring things into form. That's a bush. And that says Lilith is like, oh, a bush. And Adam is like, no, it's a tree, it's a shrub. And so they start arguing, they start quarreling over what to name things and what things are called and what things are. And then they go to have sex. This is literally in this, again, maybe satirical text, but still commenting on the Torah. They go to have sex, and she's like, okay, let me get on top. And he's like, no, I'm on top. And she's like, why? And he says, because you aren't equal to me, therefore you can't be above me. And she's like, oh, my friend, you have zero idea who I am. And so they have this quarrel, literally about if she can ride him or not. And because he says she's not equal, she utters the ineffable name of God, which in a lot of other places it's impossible. It's ineffable, so it's impossible, but she utters the the letters together. And if you do that correctly with the correct sound, it is said to give you, in some places, superpowers. So what happens is she calls God out by their name, by its name, by his name, and exiles herself. Says, I am not going to stay here. If I'm not equal, I'm not staying. So I'm out. Enjoy your fucking garden. And she flees. She doesn't flee, she exiles herself. So she flies out, she lands in the desert. Many feminist scholars talk about Lilith going to the desert as a place of like deep meditation. She goes into a cave, she goes to heal her wounds. I want to say that in a lot of these retellings of this moment, she feels so deeply betrayed and so hurt and so unseen that she is not witnessed as equal to Adam. God doesn't stick up for her. And so her only option is to leave, because why would you stay in a place where people don't respect you and they don't think that you're equal to them? So she's that spirit of like, fine, then I will go find my other place. And so she goes to the opposite of a garden, which is to a desert. And deserts are barren, but they're also quite peaceful and quiet, and they're full of, dangerous critters. And she hangs out with them. And God sends 3 angels to go beg her to come back. He's like, dude, Adam is really not doing well. Like, I really need you to go babysit him. And she's like, no, I won't do that. If I'm not going to be equal, I'm not going back. And he says, then I'm going to kill 100 of your babies every day. And she says, fine. And she makes this deal in this version of the story. She makes this deal that she will, because she's like, I will then become this kind of consuming force of life. So she's then like recreated as this entity, this deity, this goddess who is against life, who will harm your baby. And that's the deal where she says, if I see an amulet against me, I'll be okay. And there's this thing about her killing male babies, and of course, that's a part of the patriarchal terror that there won't be male children to live out the thing. And also, we wanna say, like, in this time of cultivation and owning land or building out land, of farming, what you need, and probably when we were hunter and gatherers too, but what you need is children to keep you alive, because they will do a lot of work for you, they will cultivate the land, and at this time and up until very recently, most families would have as many babies as is possible, and a lot of them would pass away. And a lot of people that gave birth would pass away. So, like, having children is one of the most daunting, wild, life creating and life defying experiences that a human with a womb can go through, because you really are at the edge of death as you give life. And so she becomes this kind of entity that people can point to say, that's why this horrific thing happened to me. How can you explain why babies don't make it, or why the birth process, can take life in such drastic ways? How else can you contextualize that but by having some kind of demon force to blame? And again, in societies all over at this time in this part of the world, there's many different demons, there's many different night spirits, there's many different spirits that you need to ward off for a lot of different things. So she's one of them. But she becomes very um, prominent in the psyche, because she's starting to hold all of these different things. So then what happens is, so she's out there existing on the periphery, in the margins, on the desert, right? In the wasteland. She's thriving, though. She will steal your husband's sperm, and she will, give birth to 1,000 demon babies, and God will take 100 of them, but it doesn't matter. She just made 1,000. So that prolificness of the goddess is very present. Her sexual power is very present in that one story, but then in all of the ways in which we learn about her, because she comes in and she's nocturnal, and she evokes our own sexual power when we are in the place of non-consciousness. So it's not a solar powered thing, it's a lunar powered thing, which is to say it's of the body. And it's what the body does in the dark, it's what the body does when the mind can start to shift into a different reality, a different way of being connected to the body. So, what I think of then is that, and again, a lot of texts will talk about this, then Eve is created. And Eve, and it's said in a lot of the different texts, is docile. She's demure in a not good way. And she is more acquiescing, obviously, to Adam. But what I think happens, and I'm sure a million other feminist scholars have written this, is that Eve comes back as the snake in the tree of knowledge and says to
Do you
Eve,
mean Lilith comes back, not Eve comes back?
thank you. So, what I think happens is Eve comes back as the snake in the tree.
Lilith.
Oh my God. So, what I think happens is that Lilith comes back as the snake in the tree of knowledge and says, Eve, my friend, you can't stay here. Get out. They will keep you contained. You will not be respected. You will never understand your own erotic power. You won't be able to access your own pleasure. You will be used in this system. You can't live like this. You need to know more. So eat this, which anytime we eat something in a dream or a myth, we're incorporating into, we're digesting into, we're taking something in. And so she says, it's rough out there, but it's better than here. These golden handcuffs you don't want. And again, a lot of rabbis would totally argue to the death. They would die on the hill of saying that's absolutely ridiculous interpretation of that situation. But that's the thing with myth, is that you can look at them through a lot of different lenses. But the ancient goddess is the snake. And I've had these conversations with a lot of rabbis. The snakes is so maligned in so many of these Jewish texts, and I think that that is the working of maligning the goddess and removing ourselves from goddess tradition and moving towards a patriarchal god. And it's like the propaganda machine of it all. So then Eve is cast out. Eve and Adam are cast out, and they have to experience the real world and the actual act of self realization outside of daddy's house. The end.
I love that telling of the story. I think I heard you speak of the snake that way on a podcast, like, maybe 12 or 13 years ago, and I that was probably honestly, probably the beginning of my interest in Lilith, so thank you for that, and I'm glad that we're sharing it with more people now.
Full circle
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been thinking a lot about the snake too, that aspect of it could stand in for Lilith, and Lilith comes back and invites the sort of temptation, because knowledge is tempting. Like, we want to know, humans are curious. We want to know what it would be like to have knowledge, tap into our power, like look beyond the gates of the garden. And so, I mean, the way as you're telling it, I was like, of course, like it just hits in that way. And that's, and also myth belongs to all of us, like I think there's scholarship, which is great. And I love it. And also, we can all step into it and see how it kind of echoes. A lot of these myths have so many different refrains. And I feel like that's also getting us out of the mind and into the kind of rhythm of the words as it reverberates as well. And so in this storytelling, I'm feeling snake energy. I'm also wearing a snake pattern.
I love it.
Yeah, and just like the astrology, the astrological traditions that all three of us come from and study and bring forth through the Chani app and all of our own individual work, is a tradition of many, 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 many different cultures all coming together in the ancient world in what we call, like the Middle East now, or North Africa and Egypt, like all of that, those sections of the world. And they were traded, they were influenced. This is multicultural societies living together and informing each other. So there's no myth from this area of the world, from these times especially, that aren't informed by other cultures and older things and oral traditions and other writings. And they're all, incorporating each other and iterating upon each other. Because even back then, colonization, when somebody would take over, it wasn't colonization like we do now. It wasn't a wipeout of a culture and a plantation of another culture. It was like, okay, well, we're your rulers now, but what do you guys got? It's cool. Okay, let's take some of this and some of that. And I'm not saying it wasn't brutal, but it's a very different orientation. It was like incorporation always. It's like, oh, we're going to take this in and mix some of ours in. And so there's no like pure one person's myth from this time period in this area of the world. Okay, so now, so that's the myth, that's the backdrop of Lilith. Now, I would like to move us into some of the astrological, astronomical significations of what does this have to do with astrology?
So before we pull up our image, because we do have an image to make this a little more intelligible to folks who are watching the YouTube. And if you're listening, this is maybe a a reason to watch the YouTube. But before we use that image, I just want to name that true to Lilith's ingraspable and like multifaceted style, there are actually a few points and one body in the sky that people over time, over history, have associated with Lilith. What we're launching in the app is Black Moon Lilith, as Chani said at the beginning, and specifically, it's the true point of Black Moon Lilith. And I'll explain what that means in just a second. But there's also an asteroid called Lilith. That's the only physical body in the sky that bears Lilith's name. There's another point that is known as Dark Moon Lilith, not to be confused with Black Moon. It's also known as the Waldemath. This is like actually a quite apocryphal point. It was when it was discovered, I believe a couple hundred years ago, it was thought to be a second moon to Earth. And it seems like there is actually no evidence for that. And it might have been a smudge in the discoverer's telescope. So this is this dark smudge that then acquired the name Lilith, which feels somehow appropriate. Um, and then quite apart from these, so these are not in the Chani app. And they're a little more rare in terms of astrological use. The main Lilith that people tend to reference in astrology is Black Moon Lilith. And just like the nodes of the moon, the lunar nodes, you can have a true calculation and a mean calculation. So the true calculation is the one that is hesitate to say most accurate because I think there's merit to both, but it's the one that is specifically calculated to exactly where Lilith is in a precise moment. So it tends to be more correct in terms of its exact location. Um, True Black Moon Lilith, it has a really wild retrograde and direct stationing cycle. It actually stations retrograde about once a month, and it'll station um, one way or another every couple weeks or so. So if you're actually like ticking forward a chart and just watching Black Moon Lilith progress through time, it goes like this, and then it goes like this, and it's just wildly flying through the sky through a sign. And it can get really confusing because you're like, why am I? Lilith was just in Libra, and a week later, it's back where it was because it has this really um, fast retrograde and direct stationing pattern. And so, in the reason why we use this point, this true point, is because I think, in my belief, that wildness does feel very appropriate to this archetype, which is this archetype of wildness, of defiance, of defying any sense of order. What the mean point is whoever came up with the mean point, I think they just thought, oh, this is really like impractical. It just keeps wobbling back and forth. Let's just do an average of all of these movements and have it constantly progressing forward. And that's what the mean point is. It's a mean or the average of all of those wobbles. Um, and it's a lot easier to use. It's a lot more tame, a lot more domesticated, a lot less wild. And for that reason, we're not using it in the app. But you might find if you go to a website and you punch in your birth data, that it's the mean point that comes up. And so you might find that in different sources, it actually comes up with a different sign and house than what we'll show in the Chani app. Because the difference between the mean and the true calculations of Black Moon Lilith are they can be worlds apart. They can at least be signs apart. So an example in my chart, my mean Black Moon Lilith is 8 degrees of Leo, and the true point at somewhere in Cancer is like 19 degrees of Cancer. So it can be like 20, 30 degrees away. So it's not at all uncommon for the mean and the true to be in totally different signs and houses. So that's just a little bit of a disclaimer or an FYI that you might come up with different Lilith placements depending on what sites you're frequenting. And I work with both. I find both interesting. Um, but I do feel like that true Black Moon point it evokes Lilith's wildness in a way that I think is significant and important. So when we had to choose one, that's the one that we chose. Okay, now we can bring up the image. So we can show you exactly what this wild point is. This is an exaggeration. This diagram is an exaggeration for you to understand. And what the outer circle or oval is showing is the orbit of the moon around Earth. So it's easy to think that the moon's orbit around Earth is a perfect circle, but it's actually an ellipsis or an oval, which is why you can see this oval here. It's not that accentuated, it's a lot more subtle, but for the sake of a diagram, this is elucidating the point. So because because the moon's orbit around Earth is an oval, that means that geometrically it has two focal points. So a circle has one focal point. That's the exact center of the circle. An oval technically has two. Of course, one of those focal points is Earth, because of course the moon orbits around Earth. But that leaves a second empty focus point. And this is the point that astrologers have named Black Moon Lilith. This point is the farthest point away within this orbit, the farthest point away from our Earth. So it's closer to the lunar apogee. That's a technical term for folks. It just means farther from Earth. So again, I think the astronomy of this evokes Lilith so well. First of all, it's like this shadow twin to our planet. It's this empty focus point. It's literally like evoking shadow and kind of this sense of those who live on the margins. And it's also farther away from our realm of familiarity. It's banished, it's exiled, it's the farthest it can be from the earth in terms of this elliptical orbit. That can be really hard to wrap our minds around. It's like hard to keep in mind. So if this is confusing, don't worry about it. Um, just know that that is what we're talking about when we're talking about the point. It's like this ghostly twin to our planet, and it's kind of relegated to the shadows. Does anyone have anything to add or?
No, I love it. I love it. And I think, it circles back to the point that if in some of the Zoharic like tales of the moon being related to the diminished, like to diminishment and be feeling like one is diminished, it's just really interesting that this is the calculation that is because of the moon's orbit,
Yeah,
which is something the ancients wouldn't have been thinking about in these terms because we didn't know this kind of stuff back then.
totally.
When was Black Moon Lilith discovered? I think I read 1930. Is that right?
Yeah,
Or discovered or calculated,
I think the earliest that I've seen have been the 1930s. But I have since tried to find that source and I can't find it. So again, it's shadowy and uncertain, but it's definitely the 20th century. Lilith herself is an ancient archetype, but Black Moon Lilith that astrologers talk about is fairly modern.
Great. I think that was really helpful for me. I always need to like relearn these things, and it made a lot of sense.
The diagram helps. So people
The
listening to
diagram
the
helps.
podcast, go
Yeah,
over to the YouTube if you want to see the
yeah,
diagram.
yeah, yeah, and we'll have it on the site somewhere too.
Yeah,
One of the
we have it on
articles.
the blog.
Yeah.
So once you find true Black Moon Lilith, the first thing that you want to do is see if it's conjunct, like within a 3-degree orb. So 3 degrees before, exact, or after. In that range, see if Lilith is conjunct, Black Moon Lilith is conjunct like a personal planet. And I think the most stunning ones, of course, are going to be the sun or the moon, or like an angle. So the ascendant, the descendant, midheaven, or IC. Because that's how you really get, like, everybody has one in their chart. So first you look for that to see if it's like really coming through solar things, like, right, like your life purpose that you kind of imbue it, or more moon things that you kind of embody it, you kind of live it out. Um, in the day to day, or if it's showing up in those other 4 angles that I said. So the ascendant would be about you. And that would be like, I mean, when I see it, when I give readings to people, it's like, it could be a fascination with wild women, or you kind of appear as if, you are a wild woman. Um, you could just like really have kind of a witch persona about you, or Lilith persona about you. You might like to wear snake print or have wild hair, or something about you that is untamable, right? I think about like also too like hair, because hair is such a thing in this country. It's like so weird. Like we like it
All
to be,
over. Hair's related,
yeah,
hair in so many different religious traditions.
get
Women
rid
have
of
to
the
cut their
hair,
hair.
pin the hair back.
Yeah. Jewish women
Um,
have to shave, in Orthodox tradition, they shave their head before they get married
so that's
because
how.
it's connected to sexuality.
Mhm. That allure of the hair.
Mhm.
Um, and there could be also too, on some level, a part of self, if it's Black Moon Lilith on the ascendant, that could be like a little bit pushed aside or relegated or rejected, or kind of just not brought into the main persona, because we all have these personas, just as to go back to all the like Lilith like myth that we're talking about of being relegated, being cast out. And so sometimes I see it like show up where people have, in addition to all those kind of surfacey persona things, like a thing that they want to bring forth. And it could be about their sexuality. It often is their expression. It could be have to do with uh, anything that is uncouth, right? That doesn't fit in, that isn't pleasing, that scratches against conformity.
I would just add that I also look for it as connected to the ruler of the ascendant.
Yes.
That I've found that when it's conjunct the ruler of the ascendant, it's usually going to be a part of what steers that person's life.
Absolutely.
So that's the planet that rules the sign, the rising sign.
Thank
Just
you.
for folks who are new to
Yeah.
that language.
Yeah.
Thank you. So in the midheaven, it could show up in a really public way, in a way that people see. And almost if you're imbuing Black Moon Lilith in the 10th or on the midheaven, it could really be like, okay, that person is really embodying all these Lilith significations. I really want to get into the example that I'm going to
Yeah,
get into.
let's. Yeah.
What should I do later?
No, I mean, I think this is a great segue. And then I'll just say that, we're releasing Lilith now in the app because the app has an astrology chart. Obviously, everything does. And in the chart, it's in the fourth house of our foundations and like how we build the app and like our roots and everything. And it just so happens that this is our fourth year of being in existence. And by something called perfections, we're in our fourth house year. And so we thought, in honor to it, in a way that we wanted to honor Lilith, we thought we'd release her in the fourth house in a year where she's technically, we would say, being released in our chart. So this is to honor the Lilith in the Chani app's astrology chart. And then, of course, also to help everybody else connect to this placement in their chart as well.
So thank you. I before I get to the 10th, I'll say the 7th on the descendant could be like the projection of it all, right? The outsourcing onto the other, it appearing in relationships, like an opportunity to work with Lilith that is suddenly presented to you in those long-term partnerships. And that feels like an exciting, if not hard, opportunity as well. Um, Josephine Baker's chart, I should say who Josephine Baker is.
Okay,
She's a
yes. Introduce us to her.
entertainer, performer, dancer, icon, was called Black Venus, Black Pearl, also Black Angel. These are like quotes. So a lot of the Black of it, so she was a Black woman. She was born in the 1900s, early part of the 20th century in St. Louis, Missouri. So we know the terror that she was born into. And in order for Josephine Baker, as I dug into her life to see how this archetype showed up, there's themes that are echoed at different periods of her life of exile, of being on the outside. And one of the first things she did as somebody who had big dreams, who didn't want to live under that terror, who didn't want to live in that walled civilization that did not work for her, was to leave the confines of that, first going to New York and kind of dipping her toes into the Harlem Renaissance and being a part of a dance troupe called the Chocolate Dandies, and then being like, I want more. And then leaving the country and creating a storm, a cessation for the way that she expressed her sexuality. So we all have that image of Josephine Baker in a skirt that is made of fake bananas. They're like tumescent bananas essentially. And like she's topless or she's got a necklace on. And so you're seeing her skin and her body, and she's shaking and she's shimmying on stage in Paris in the 1920s in this kind of unabashed, completely free, with a wink and a nod, using like all these kind of like stereotypes and tropes of what it means to be a Black woman, what it means to be uncivilized, and turning it on its head. And so Josephine Baker had Black Moon Lilith conjunct her sun in Gemini. So first of all, it was almost, I was getting lost in the like twinness of this all, because there's the um antithesis of the moon, right? So the kind of like um the moon's empty focal point, so there's like a duality there, but then there's the Gemini, so there's many different faces to how Josephine would imbue Black Moon Lilith conjunct her sun. She's got a Gemini stellium, so there's a lot of duplicity and here, there, everywhere. The change, I'm thinking costume changes. I'm thinking, I mean, also she's got Venus, Neptune. We won't get into it, but there's the changeability, the shape shifting that is happening and that people are witnessing and almost riveted by. Um, and so the way that she lived her life was to really, once she put herself in exile overseas and creates a career, she's really like, I can't stand America. She said that, like, quoted, I can't stand America, because she couldn't stand the racial terror. Like, who could stand that? She was quoted as saying, like, a Black childhood is always a little sad. She thought that she would improvise on it. That's what she said. I want to improvise on that. Some of the ways that it showed up in her artistry is that she was in a movie called Zuzu and sometime in the 1930s. And there's this whole scene where Josephine is on stage and she's dancing. She's like in this movie performing as an entertainer. And she's on stage, but she's more riveted at her shadow, which is projected like huge on this wall behind her and is bigger and taking up more space than her actual form. And she's kind of winking at the shadow and she's like, look at my shadow. And she's kind of dancing around it. And she's even enthralled with her own shadow. And to me, that is just so Black Moon Lilith of like, look at that empty thing. Like, I'm here, but like, look at this big shadow that I cast. Um, and as a performer, she definitely played with shadow, with appearance and disappearance as well. A lot has been written about that. Hiding in the limelight, like now you see me, now you don't. And that really came about as like in 2020, they discovered like a lot of confidential documents were released from World War II, specifically in France. And so we learned a lot about how she moved intelligence through writing like allied intelligence with invisible ink on her sheet music and moving behind enemy lines because people just wanted to see Josephine. And so nobody knew that she was actually for the resistance, like that she was actually like helping the war. They're just seeing her flashiness and they're enthralled. Um, so
So she's showing one side, doing the other, and being duplicitous for the greatest good. Note to other Geminis out there.
you can use it for good.
You can use it for good. Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of there's a lot about her first movie was called The Siren of the Tropics. I was even thinking about this image of a siren in Greek mythology as like a part bird woman, also kind of a seductress who could kill you or with her screeches. And so there was a lot of Lilith coming through in that way. Like sometimes I think what happens, so if it's in like, so by the way, I misspoke. I think I said midheaven, but here in Josephine's chart, it's in the 10th house. This is a B-rated chart. So we could just say it's really the sun that I'm really betting on is that kind of coming through in the persona, in the like the light of it all, the big stage of this is Lilith, and it's coming through also her artistry and Mercury, which has a really big job in her chart. It's kind of like between there. Um, so
If this is her time of birth. But also,
yes,
you're
it
right, as ruler of all that Gemini.
all the Gemini stellium.
I thought it was interesting. It's the Eliza, I always get the name wrong, but it's the Anzu bird, ANZZU. So like the Zuzu and the Anzu, there's just like a play on words there. The Zuzu bird, the Anzu bird in Anna's garden as part of the Lilith mythology, and then the name of the movie Zuzu, where she's playing with her shadow, which is so like Gemini Lilith. It's like Gemini is so playful and it so loves the double, and then Lilith is that shadowy figure.
That was really a fun discovery. I got like Astro chills every single time. Okay, a couple other Lilith things I thought appeared is that like later in life, she like wanted to adopt like a brigade of children. So she adopted like a dozen children that she called like the Rainbow Tribe. Anyway, she wanted to build this thing that she didn't think was possible. She wanted to adopt like different children of different cultures. And I thought in that like sort of prolific, here are my children kind of way, that was also very Lilith.
Yeah, she's
Um,
got so many. And Lilith, it's said in one of the Zoharic excerpts, I think, that she spoke 70 languages, which when you're reading things from that tradition, it means the whole world. If you see the number 70, it means everything and everybody. So there's this like way that Lilith spans the entire, every single kind of population.
I did not know that. That is
Mhm.
also really stunning.
Mhm.
Well, and the
Um,
fact that she knew the ineffable name of God, like, that's not
Yeah.
something that most people could utter. But anyway, just that the
Yeah.
power of that. But
Yeah.
sorry, go on, Thea.
Well, that could be like the power of secret information, right?
Yeah, and she was a spy.
Yeah. There's lots of ways. I was like, is this, but it is interesting that the Gemini, but also the Lilith. So
Mhm.
I think to pull back out, I could talk about this chart for a very long time. But I think the other part of it is that, um, you know, it to have Lilith conjuncture Sun, I think makes it like visible and um, radiant in a kind of way that, I think it was difficult for her in her life, but that she played with. It just came through. And thankfully, we have like all these images. I mean, she was like the most photographed woman at that
Wow.
time in the 1920s. So we
That's
have all
so
these images of her.
Venus and Neptune, the
I
most
know,
photographed woman.
probably. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. Like the way in which she's using the shadow figure of racist, imaginings and delusions cast upon her, and subverting it, and putting it back out, and owning the all the things, and reclaiming her power through her own body and her own. I mean, talk about, like, she would perform at night, and I'm sure
Mm.
give men a thrill, and have a lot of nighttime emissions being spilled. So, like,
I'm
she
sure
just
this.
like fully embraced that with so much. I think of Gemini in like its best form as like so like hysterical and funny, and also like a butterfly. Like there's just so much exuberant, kind of like bubbly joy to that sign, or at least like that effervescence. And
100%.
What I want to pull out too from what you've shared, Thea, is like you could have this experience and feel like her experience of growing up in St. Louis, being a Black woman or a Black young young child. So easily you could have that experience and think that you were resigned to it. But I think part of, or resigned to the racism, resigned to the terror that was, a very real threat to her and her family at that time. And I think what I see and what you've described with Josephine Baker, and what I hear also in the Lilith story, is she had like she had the ability to remove herself from that. She had the ability to exile. She had the ability to kind of choose a different path, which must have been so hard. But you see that refusal in the Lilith story, where she's refusing to lay under Adam, and she's deciding to choose the desert. She's deciding to choose this unknown, rather than stay in the Garden of Eden. And in this
Mhm.
case, is kind of America, and Josephine Baker's like, nope, I'm out. I don't
It
know what
totally is.
lays for me on the other side of the world, but she's choosing that exile because for her that is preferable. And clearly somehow she had the ability to get there. I don't know. I don't. Do you know how? I'm sure
How
many
she got
people
to
want to
Paris,
move.
she, like, auditioned for a Parisian while
Ah,
she was in Harlem. She, like, kind of
got
found
it.
an opportunity. And she also later in life did renounce her US citizenship. So she, like, literally was like, "Bye."
Hmm.
she's also a
Yeah.
Jupiter sun. We
She had
could
luck
say
too.
she had some
Yeah,
luck. She had a lot of exuberance, and was able to. It's not a melancholic signature. Let's just say
No.
that it's a like,
true.
hey, amazing. Thank you, Thea. Audre Lorde's chart is one that I wanted to talk about. This. So Audre Lorde is self-described as a Black lesbian mother warrior poet. She wrote many different books, and she passed away in the 90s, unfortunately, from cancer. But she was, if you don't know who she is, you should definitely go study her. I think most people that are listening to this will, but she is one of the most adored, revered feminists who really schooled white feminists on intersectionality and the fact that there's no single issue ever, because we have to consider that people live at the intersections of a million different identities. And I just want to read some of the titles of her books and some of the titles of some of her most famous essays. Because it's really, I don't need to say much once you just come into contact with the fact that one of her notable book titles is Sister Outsider, The Black Unicorn. Lorde wrote 18 books of essays and poetry, for which she won numerous awards, including the American Book Award for A Burst of Light. So 18 books, it's very prolific. She had a couple of children as well. But one of her most famous essays is called The Uses of the Erotic as Power. And then another one, of course, is The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. So we have someone who is by word saying the themes of Lilith. And I'm going to read a couple of like excerpts from some of these things, but all that to say, I've given this as homework many times, but please go read Uses of the Erotic if you want to understand more about Lilith and definitely about Audre Lorde and feminism in general. But this is an A rating. So when Thea and I are saying like A rating, B rating, astro.com is a great source for seeing which times we have for people are like super certified or not so super certified. So you always want a double A rating. That's the best rating you can get. An A rating is pretty good. I trust it, significantly. A B rating, you're like, okay, maybe like it might be off an hour or two, or, we've got to kind of take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. So I will say that in this chart as an A rating, so we're not 100% sure, that we have Black Moon Lilith conjunct the midheaven, which could be less. It's by a degree, so it's a very tight conjunction. It could be less so if the time is a little bit different, but it's good enough for, I think, me to go on. And because her work is so very literal in terms of its embodiment of Lilith's myths and themes, I think it's really important to mention. She's also a Libra rising. So that gives us the ruler of her ascendant, which tells us about the quality and nature of her life and the direction that she needs to go in this life. And the ruler of Libra is Venus, which is a planet of eroticism and erotic power and creativity. And it's in the fifth house of sex and pleasure and play and joy. So it's in Aquarius, so and it's with Saturn and the North Node. So it's super hungry and it's very, very, very serious and it's very particular and it's very structured and it's very dedicated. It's very disciplined with her Aquarius sun. So it's that like style, but we're talking about erotic energy in a lot of different ways. So I just want to say it's kind of enhanced with the other setup. And she has an 11-degree Libra rising, which is in the middle of the sign. So it's another reason to trust the setup just a little bit more. It's not like at the very beginning or the very end. Okay. So Audre Lorde, so I just want to read a little bit. The uses of the erotic as power. This is her writing. There are many kinds of power, used and unused, acknowledged or otherwise. The erotic is a resource within each of us that lies in a deeply female and spiritual plane, firmly rooted in the power of our unexpressed or unrecognized feeling. In order to perpetuate itself, every oppression must corrupt or distort those various sources of power within the culture of the oppressed that can provide energy for change. For women, this has meant a suppression of the erotic as a considered source of power and information within our lives. We have been taught to suspect the resource, vilified, abused, and devalued within Western society. On one hand, the superficially erotic has been encouraged as a sign of female inferiority. On the other hand, women have been made to suffer and to feel both contemptible and suspect by virtue of its existence. It is a short step from there to the false belief that only by the suppression of the erotic within our lives and consciousness can women be truly strong. But that strength is illusory, for it is fashioned within the context of male models of power. She goes on to say, and there's a famous picture of her with this written on a chalkboard, of course, women so empowered are dangerous. So there's this image of her with, as she's written, women are powerful and dangerous on a chalkboard. And the very word erotic comes from the Greek word eros, the personification of love in all of its aspects, born of chaos and personifying creative power and harmony. When I speak of the erotic, then, I speak of it as an assertion of the life force of women, of that creative energy empowered, the knowledge and the use of which are now reclaiming in our language, our history, our dancing, our loving, our work, our lives. Another couple of really important quotes from her are, I learned that if I don't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive, which I feel is so evocative of the Lilith myth, because she leaves, she exiles herself because she's not seen as who she is. So rather than stay somewhere that's comfortable and beautiful, she'd rather be on the outside and define herself for herself. And then also, when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it's better to speak. And so I think of, Eliza pointed to this, but those that are really prolific in their ability to speak and write and articulate and educate and be these kind of teachers that transcend their own lifespan as being that part of Lilith that brings the ineffable words into existence. And the title of the essay, "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House," is like, Liz is like, well, I'm not going to stay in this garden and try to like convince you that I am equal to you. I'm going to go somewhere else now. And in that essay, she's addressing basically a group of white feminists that didn't consider Black women, women from the global South, lesbian. She goes through this like list, and she's like, if you're not considering other people besides yourselves, then you're not. This isn't. I don't want to. And so it's like within any context, it's like who is being marginalized. And if you have Lilith in the 10th house, like Thea was saying, in this significant place, like near the midheaven, sun, moon, ascendant, ruler of the ascendant, or of course also Mercury, then the thing is to say what no one wants to hear. You're going to be the one that's going to say the thing that is true and deeply inconvenient for the entire system and paradigm that you are in at that moment. And so you are going to have to learn, as all of us are in many different ways, whether we have Lilith prominently or not, because we live within these systems and societies that are deeply inequitable. But you have to learn to be totally fine with being alone in that moment, with being the only one, with being with the feeling of exile, or with the feeling of having to go out into the desert and be like, I guess I'll just have the company of my own demon spawn. Like it's a thing of being the outsider.
Sister outsider.
Yep.
I mean, I think this is also too why I think there are so many women, queer women, women of color, Black women who are like, if I'm born into the white male imagination, I might have to flee it, right? She's in that quote you read, like, I had to risk being crunched, like, I had to leave, or else I was going to be crunched. Sorry. So, like, I think that it just echoes throughout time, right? And that white male imagination is like white male God. It's like that same thing, that to go back to the myths of like, I have to get out of here. And that just really comes through in everything that you read. And I mean, we're still quote doing the quote about the master's tools, like like that it just echo it was so brilliant too. Um and um and then also just the uses of the erotic. Um as like that being like her pinnacle work, um, really feels like I do kind of trust that midheaven placement, or at least 10th house placement for sure.
Yeah, and I think, and also, if we go into the roots of Lilith's story as being about an essentially non-binary God creating a non-binary first human, or both, everything, all, then it also talks a lot about queer folks and the construction of a gender binary and that kind of like original split. So like anybody who feels marginalized by a system that only sees the one and the other.
When we have points like Lilith on the midheaven, it tends to be what we're known for. It tends to be like where our reputation is shining, and it's hard to hide. And so I just think, like, in the titles alone, but never mind also just her life's work and literally what was disseminated to the world, the archetype of Lilith truly is like shining over everything. So I do find this a really stunning example. Ditto for Josephine Baker, because that was another, well, 10th house situation, but with her son, which is also representing the life work. So these are all very visible. Okay, so the next example is Amy Winehouse. So this is an example, and we won't linger too long here because frankly I don't know like that much about Amy Winehouse. But this was an example where it's just like her image, her visuals, you instantly read and see Lilith. She had, she styled her hair with this big beehive. You see all these images of her where her hair is um akimbo. She has that kind of um that night creature, night hag appearance in many ways. The way she did her eyeshadow, she was very her just her style, her aesthetic was very Lilith coded. So here we see again, it's another Lilith MC example, and this is A rated as well. So I do tend to trust A rated charts, but who knows? It could be plus or minus. It is to the her birth time is to the 25, which tends to be more accurate than like exactly rounded. But anyway, here we are. So she's got a Lilith MC conjunction in Aquarius. And I think with Aquarius too, we do get a bit of that outsider status. There's something about Aquarius's ability to detach that I think means they're exceptional and not like pleasing people. And I mean, that's with Lilith as well. And what you see in her, in what's been written about her in terms of her childhood is she was always getting into trouble. Like she wasn't there to just, get gold stars. There's one story of how when she was called to the principal's office, which I think happened like more than once, she would just be singing to herself, "Fly Me to the Moon." Her dad used to sing Frank Sinatra to her, and this she was like imagining going to the moon as she was going to the principal's office, but I think in a really like piss taking way. um, one of her friends who I think became well known in her own right, Billie Piper, this is a friend at a theater school they went to. She said that Amy Winehouse as a kid was like constantly pushing people's buttons, and for this reason actually was bullied a little bit because I think she was just again not demure, not trying to fit into cookie cutter boxes, not always doing what was expected of her. It sounds like she was brilliant. Like she was very, very clever, but I think bored and acted out a lot. And I that kind of comes through, at least that brilliance comes through, I think, in the Aquarius placement as well. There is a brilliance to that sign. If again, not always ticking the boxes just for the sake of ticking boxes. Um, what I see with Amy too, as she becomes a performing artist and, kind of fell into these traps, and it sounds like mental health. She kind of really struggled with her mental health for much of her life, even before she was well known. She had an eating disorder. Her bulimia was um, well documented, I guess one could say. She also had substance use issues. She ended up dying due to alcohol poisoning, but I think she, dabbled in a lot of different substances and was very quote unquote uncontrolled in that way. I mean, she literally released a song called Rehab, which
Yeah.
like the lyrics to that song are they try to make me go to rehab and I said no, no, no. So that like refusal coming
Mhm.
into it, people are encouraging her to get sober, and she worried it would meddle with her creativity.
Mhm.
And she, she was young when she died. She was 27. So I think she
Mhm.
never really reached that point where, in her case,
Mhm.
she felt it was maybe time to grow
Mhm.
out of that path. I'm not sure.
Mhm.
But um there so she was described by friends as being mouthy, funny, sultry, and quite possibly crazy. I just think those words are very Lilith invoking themselves, like
Mhm.
sultry, funny, mouthy. I feel like Lilith is
Mhm.
mouthy.
Yes.
Um, and yeah, she was erratic and volatile. So sometimes she'd be on stage, she'd be intoxicated, and audience members would start booing and she'd start swearing at the audience, or she was just like not really in possession of her faculties. So she has, like, I think the shadow of Lilith is strong in her as well, but also just that quote unquote uncontrolled nature. She was not someone who was always in possession of herself or always s- self-possessed. She was just kind of like, I think, really well, wild in that way. She kind of like a bit feral in some ways, just not letting herself be tamed, both in her visual appearance, in her music, and then just like her lifestyle. And ultimately, it didn't end well for her. Amy Winehouse is said to be of the 27 Club, so the performance artists who tend to die at age around 27, often due to substance use or overdoses. And Janis Joplin, who's another example we have, also died at 27. She's also part of that, club, as it were. So I think that like parallel is really interesting between them.
Right, and
Um,
in astrology, I just wanna say that's, like, the beginning of a lot of people's like, it's right before the beginning of a Saturn return, so
totally.
it's like people don't make it to live through the Saturn return, which is the time where we have to really, like, face reality and grow up or go through something really challenging to make a really big shift and understand our own mortality and the sacredness of the time we have.
Back to Black was, like, her biggest
Oh
album.
my god,
Yeah,
great
I
She's
point.
so
know.
Lilith.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanna add something too that I think is really important. That one of the things is that Lilith has been an archetype that's been really romanticized by a lot of different feminist kind of like movements or iterations throughout the ages, and yes, great. And also that there is truth in the fact that she's she's misunderstood and she's maligned. And then also there is something to be wary of when we're dealing with a force that is the thing that holds the antithesis to the scheme we're living in, right? So this is an energy to be really, it's not to be feared, but it's to be deeply respected and to be understood that it is misunderstood. And even in our like, oh, I'm going to reclaim that, it's like, okay, but we really have to understand what we're reclaiming and understand the power of it and what it is we're dealing with, and that it's not energy that is for the faint of the heart. Like Josephine Baker makes it look easy, but God only knows what she actually had to contend with as a human being, because these are like big archetypal forces that we're talking about, and we're just little piddly humans, no matter how sparkly and artistically talented we are. And someone like Audre Lorde makes it look easy because she's so brilliant. Her mind is so phenomenal, and like she's so intellectually sturdy that she can move through these concepts. But as a human being, what did that mean for her to have to articulate these things over and over again and spell it out for you know all these white folks and like have to do that hard labor of that so many black and women of color have had to do. So there's that piece of it I just want to put down here. We're not trying to only see one side of this situation. I think all three of us are very respectful or like know that this isn't easy stuff to live with or to deal with. And I in the chart readings that I've done, a lot of pain comes up when you talk to people personally about what they've had to live through publicly and how they've been ostracized, maligned, misunderstood, blamed, shamed, and been the one that's had to hold the psychic baggage for a group or a movement or a moment in time. And it's usually the people that are already marginalized in the situation that are going to have to hold that psychic gunk or stuff or unprocessed material. But I also want to say that I think Amy Winehouse and Janis Joplin are really good depictions because their stories don't end in success. Whereas Audre Lorde and Josephine Baker have, these just like incredible uh, I don't know if they felt like they ended in success, but they have these incredible, lifespans and life's work, and it wasn't by their own demise that they passed. So the thing that I think is really important to remember with Lilith is that because she represents a split between she's like the mother and the whore kind of archetypal split, right? Lilith is the bad girl, and then she's juxtaposed towards the good girl. And if we're splitting our psyche between the nourishing part of us, the mother, the one who loves, the one who adores, the one who knows how to feed, and the one who is the strangler of life, the one who's the demon, the one who's, all that erotic energy has to be siphoned off somewhere, then we don't know the self-love, right? Because the everything that goes bad and wrong in Lilith's myths or in the things associated with her is from a lack of love and understanding. And so when we don't know how to love and understand ourselves, then we don't know how to value what it is we bring. We end up, like being that Lilith archetype up on stage, just completely self-destructive because we've not learned how to self-love. And I think in both Josephine and Audre's like examples, there's a ton of self-love that they demonstrate as artists and as people in the world. And in Amy's case and in Janis's case, there's a lot of self-destruction while being these really unique and wild and so different and so odd, kind of like quote unquote, like women in their industry. Because Janis was seen as like, I think, ugly and, like, why would she didn't look like, there's like a bit of like hag energy. She had wild hair. She wasn't typically pretty. She didn't sound typical. She didn't fit into any kind of mold. And it's like part of her story that I don't know if she ever experienced that kind of like full acceptance of how different she was, or if they couldn't survive the systems they were in.
Well, Janice too, she was, like Amy and like other examples that we have, was bullied as a child, and she was bullied because of her appearances, and they called her all sorts of really terrible names that I won't repeat here, but, it's she self-describes as having joined a group of outcasts as friends in high school, which again, like sister outsider, like, Lilith the outcast, Lilith the exile. And she self-exiles from Texas. She says she leaves Texas in 1963 because she had to get away. And she tries to make a name for herself. But I think that self-love piece that you mentioned, Chani, is crucial because I do think in both of these examples, you're right, that was missing and it was detrimental. What I find just striking also about the Janice, well, with both of these examples and with another one we'll get to, is they also lived outside the law in a way. To be using substances in these ways, you're not abiding by law and order. And Janis Joplin was actually arrested for shoplifting in
Mm.
1963, which sounds very similar to
Wait, hold
another
on. Just say
example we have.
where Janis's Lilith is for people that aren't watching this.
Yes, thank you. Janis Joplin's Lilith is in Cancer at 11 degrees of Cancer, and it's conjunct her moon at 8 degrees of Cancer. So this is a slightly wider orb. It's 3 degrees apart, but still very tight.
And that Cancer setup is so incredible.
Mhm.
and it's in the 6th house of work, so what she would be known
And
for producing.
health and body.
Right, because it's in
Yeah.
Cancer and it's sitting with Jupiter, which is exalted there. So it says something phenomenal and wild and different and weird is happening in terms of her work.
Yes. Yeah. And also what I love about Janis Joplin's example and Amy Winehouse is their voices were so unique to them. And like Lilith as Screech Owl, I think Janis Joplin, like her voice was not tame. It was not
Pretty,
dulcet tones. Like it was very just like husky and salty
raw.
and gritty, raw. Yes. And same with Amy Winehouse's. I mean, I think her voice in some ways it was bigger and older than who she was. Like people often said that she was just so evocative of jazz singers. And I really think that there's something about both of these figures where they seem almost a little outside of time somehow. Um, both again bullied, both both living outside the law in different ways. And then another person who was arrested for shoplifting, who got very maligned in the media for it, was Winona Ryder. So Winona has an exact conjunction between Lilith, Black Moon Lilith, and the sun in Scorpio in the 12th house. And the 12th house is literally a house that we associate with imprisonment and places of retreat, with places of isolation. And I mean,
Self-destruction, maybe.
self-destruction too. I mean, Winona Ryder, first of all, she was just like, she came of fame as a goth, as this goth girl character in Beetlejuice. Like the images of her character in that movie are so evocative of Lilith. And she always plays in these very like similarly styled films. She was in Edward Scissorhands. I mean, she was in The Heathers, which is like itself very subversive of and like quite outside of demureness, let's say, if
Mhm.
people have seen that The Heathers.
Well, doesn't she
And
also get bullied in Heathers?
I think so.
I think her
I
character
think so.
it's about like cool girls and not who's in, who's out,
Yeah.
who's yeah.
It's like Mean Girls before there was Mean Girls, but way more salty
Edgier.
and like vulgar and
Mhm.
crass and dangerous.
Yeah. Gen X style.
um, and then Stranger Things. So she's always in these like shadowy, mysterious, gothy
Mm.
nighttime films. This is kind of her character, characters and that she often plays in films that she often partakes in or TV series she often partakes in. And her career was really soaring, and then she got arrested for shoplifting in 2001. And suddenly she was no longer the it girl. So she was it sounds like she was actually not allowed to make certain movies because she couldn't get insured on set because of this legal issue. And so there was like, I think Woody Allen wanted to cast her in something and he literally couldn't because they just couldn't get insurance for her. And meanwhile, the media was vicious. They were like tearing her apart. She herself said it was like her experience at that time was it was a really hard time actually to be a woman that
Mhm.
was famous. Like the media was ruthless. I
Yeah,
mean,
there was no
arguably
social media back then.
there's no social media, but just like the media.
Mhm.
And she basically had to stay out of the limelight and didn't make another film until like 2009, 2010. So that was like almost a 10-year, actually it was 9 years, which is interesting because Black Moon Lilith takes 9 years to go through the zodiac. So I didn't check
Wow.
what
Yeah,
transit she was going through in 2001, but that would be
the
curious to
cycle,
look
yeah.
at.
Yeah.
But Amy Winehouse too was like completely, the media was vicious with her. There were headlines, saying like Amy Winehouse on crack. Like they were just, I think a lot of these figures um, experienced such public scrutiny, which is a different form of bullying. It's a different form of ostracization, and in some ways, it's so much more extreme because all eyes are on you, and all eyes are, on you in a very judgmental and critical way. So I thought that was an interesting example too. I thought it was kind of just a weird synchronicity that both Winona Ryder and Janis Joplin were arrested for shoplifting. It
Yeah.
just also seems
It's like
somehow on point.
yeah, because it's like it's so uncouth. It's
Hmm.
like just So it was so shame. It was just like so shocking when that, it's like, because again, we were living in such a different time, but um, yeah, those are
The
amazing
stealing
examples.
something too feels
Yeah.
very like
Yeah.
taking something that's not yours.
Yeah.
I did wanna add too, I know we're on Winona, but Josephine Baker was also maligned too
Mm,
in the American press, like, Time magazine called her a Negro wench, which is, like, so, like,
Lilith.
do you know what I mean? It's like, she had this sensation, spectacular career, but she was really never embraced by the country that birthed her. So,
right.
like, I mean, I'm sure that had to be incredibly painful.
Hmm. And just to go back to Audre Lorde's quote, like, if I don't define myself for myself, then I'll be eaten alive, to paraphrase. I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive.
Mm.
Wow.
Okay, and then we just threw in like, one of the most famous women for other reasons, Marilyn Monroe, into this thing because Eliza found her chart. It's a double A rating.
I believe so, yeah.
And so she has Lilith on the ascendant. Now, what I thought was really fascinating about this is because she was so known as, I mean, I'm sure that if you lived at that time, she was so scandalous in so many ways. So there's like her like evoking that obviously like patriarchal male attention, and that she's, the other woman in a lot of her work. She's that kind of archetype that attracts so much envy and jealousy and energy. And also she's so beloved. So it's not like, I'm sure in contact, when she came into contact with men, which I think we all know is true, she probably felt a lot of the hatred of toxic masculinity towards the object that they desire. And also she was so, she's remembered as somebody so loved, which maybe we can say is true for a lot of women in retrospect. Uh, but she didn't lead with like the night demon kind of persona. She led with the blonde everybody loves, and was the, quote unquote ideal woman at that time, but maybe not the ideal wife, like not the ideal in the garden. Maybe
The
she's the
ideal
ideal
seductress?
seductress, but in a very like, white woman, blonde woman, all the things, perfection kind of way. But she never finds love. She never finds
Mm,
happiness. She never finds her home. She never finds her garden to exist within. And it seems like that having to live out that projection is what, uh, like, that what ultimately takes away from so much of her ability to exist and thrive as a human.
That split that you were talking about earlier
Hmm.
makes a lot of sense.
just in terms of her, like, more bubbly persona, I mean, her Lilith is in Leo. So
True.
it's like, so she has Black Moon Lilith conjunct the ascendant in Leo, and it is a little more solar. It's gonna be a little more sunshiny, a little more
Hmm.
golden girl,
Hmm.
than,
Mhm.
some of the other examples that we've shown so far, which had them in water signs or in air signs. Um, but I think too, like, I do think, no one, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I feel like not many people enter show business with the thought, I'm going to be a sex symbol. Like, I'm going to be, almost synonymous with sex appeal. And I do think that was projected onto her. And it's something that I find when you have a planet on the ascendant, you don't necessarily even have control over what you're exuding or what people perceive you exuding, but people kind of see you in this veneer or in this clothing. And that was, as you said, like, projected on her, whatever she was trying to do with her, acting career. Um, I also just think it's an interesting anecdote that when she first got into show business, there was initially a huge scandal because these nude photos of her were discovered, and so this was at first like um, considered quite scandalous and considered very taboo, and then people actually found it more interesting, and it ended up in this strange way advancing her career. But that um, stepping outside the lines, quote unquote, around propriety when it comes to her woman's body or just like sexiness in general, nudity in general, especially in that era. I think that was also very in its way, this is probably debatable, but in its way there is a subversiveness there, even though, you know
She was used by the
yes.
systems, and I don't think she
Mhm.
even ever made a lot of money off of, like all of her images got sold. She didn't make the money that she should have, all that stuff. But yes, she was in the system and kind of like subverting it in her own way at the same time. So she's like kind of always energetically working those different ways of being, but
Mhm.
ultimately gets eaten by the system.
And
Yeah.
she's, like, obviously a thinker in this chart with, like, all
Mhm.
this air sign activity.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Sun, Mercury in Gemini, Moon, Jupiter in Aquarius. And so but we don't
Mhm.
know that about her. We just know the
Mhm.
bombshell. So I'm sure
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
wonder about the, like, kind of the split self too in that way.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
Well, she loved studying acting,
yeah.
and she loved, playwrights, and she loved the real craft, and she took it really seriously. So intellectually. Also, Thea, you also have the moon Jupiter in Aquarius.
And you also
Thinks
love
too much.
studying.
She thinks too much.
So you know of what you speak. It's a
Yeah.
lot of thinking. Okay, so I think we should. There's a lot of other, examples we can go into. We can always circle back to this, but I think we want to, tell people that we have Lilith in the app. Eliza's team spent a lot of time writing them. There was a lot of different people involved. You can name them all in a sec, Eliza, but we want we introduced her so you can definitely read where she is in your chart, where it is in your chart by sign and by house. And most of us won't. I don't have anything. I've been obsessed with Lilith for a decade plus, and I don't have any major configuration with Lilith, but I have talked about her and I have studied her and I've worked with her a lot. So if you feel really connected to the things that we're saying, if you're like, oh my God, that's so me, but then you pull this Black Moon Lilith up in your chart and you don't find it of any significance, that's okay. It's like, this is an archetype, and archetypes are the power of them is that they hold part of our human experience. So we all have a connection to her because we are all existing in some part of her myth. And you also might notice that by transit, when something goes over this point in your chart, this theme will get really kind of like kicked up. And I just want to say, like, you can feel deeply related to Lilith just because you exist on the margins in some way and not have something profound in your chart about her, and that might be a good thing. Like, this is a hefty archetype to carry, and it's not to say, like, if you do have it, somewhere significant, that it's a bad thing. It's not like that. It's just like, be careful of what you're like, oh, I wish I had that, or I wish I had something more significant with it. It's like, everything's perfect in your chart,
Yeah.
actually, and everything is as it needs to be. And it's our job to kind of like meet it and understand it instead of our chart morphing to what we understand about ourselves, because these are big, 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 big energies and forces. So if you don't have Lilith anywhere significant or by anything significant in your chart, you can still look in the transit section of the app and see when Lilith is making an important transit to something in your life. And, when you go and reflect on your own kind of astrological history, there might be times like, if you did go through a big Lilith experience, you might be able to, like, go back and be like, was Lilith transiting anything significant, and find out where that is. So there's different ways that we can kind of play with this knowledge and understand it, and and just don't feel not special if it's not somewhere significant. You have a right to being in connection with this archetype and with this myth and with anything that you find healing here. And then also, I put 3 different guided meditations, which are really actually journeys into the app. Some of them are a little longer than others, but they are journeys into our relationship with this archetype and with this part of self. So again, if you feel connected to it, I recommend going into the app, into the meditation section of the app, and trying one of those out and seeing what comes, because that's also like a part of interacting with these archetypes is going into more like liminal spaces, which is where Lilith kind of resides. It's not in the bright light of day of consciousness. You want to go make some space. And so I hope those meditations also help to facilitate some understanding of your relationship with her.
Watch your dreams after. I would be really
Yeah.
curious how people's dreams start to absorb Lilith after doing some of those meditations because, again, it's shadowy. It's like dealing in the subconscious in these ways. I'd be really curious what kind of symbols creep in.
And a lot of information can be gleaned just by understanding where she is by sign and house in your chart.
Yeah,
For sure.
that's huge. I'll
What's
tell
your
you what.
Lilith flavor?
Eliza, do you want to talk about who was writing these and all the people that were
Yes.
involved? Because there was many.
It'd be my pleasure. So, a lot of people were involved in writing all of our Lilith content. Some of the initial material was written by Leah Samuels, who is a contractor before the whole team was hired, and it's also been written by Stephanie Warner, who got us started as well in a really significant way, and Serena Romero and Grace Mungavin. Those are the main writers. And then I also want to give a shout out to the copy editors who helped hone and uh, bring it into form, shine it into form, which are Casey McGeary and Stephen Fow. So thank you to all those folks for making these words exist in the app.
And to you, because you're part of the writing and shaping process.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eliza.
All right. Is there anything you think we missed in this installment of our ode to Lilith?
The only thing I wanted to say, if it's interesting, is that Lilith, Black Moon Lilith in the sky is conjunct Venus, and we're adoring Lilith right now. So it
Oh,
feels very sweet and special.
yeah.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, we're recording this on September 12th. And they're in Libra, so Venus is super powerful. So it feels like a very loving connection to the one who's not always been so appreciated and loved. And just to if you want to connect with this archetype, it's also it's about loving the part of you that feels misunderstood, maligned, marginalized, too loud, too much, too screechy, too anything. That part of you
Totally.
deserves and also needs your love. And I think another one of Audre Lorde's quotes that fits this so well is the very famous one, which is caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare.
Hear, hear.
There we go.
All right. Thank you all so much. This was exhilarating. And so I learned so much from both of you.
Me too.
Same.
Me too.
I got to be a student on Lilith, so thank you.
Yeah. And to
Always.
all the charts we read, to all the ancestors we evoked, and all of that. Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.